Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Before the world knew Mosul as a battlefield, it was already a city in slow collapse. Long before artillery shattered its skyline and drones circled overhead, fear had seeped into its streets, house by house, neighborhood by neighborhood. Mosul was once Iraq's second-largest city, a place of merchants and students, ancient mosques and modern cafes, a city that had survived empires. But by 2016, it existed in a different state altogether, suspended between life and death. 2 years earlier, in the summer of 2014, Mosul had fallen with stunning speed. Iraqi army units dissolved almost overnight, uniforms discarded as soldiers fled north and south. Into the vacuum marched black-clad fighters carrying the banners of the Islamic State. Within days, the city was theirs. Within weeks, it was transformed. Public squares became execution grounds. Music disappeared. Books were burned. Women vanished behind walls and veils. Minorities, Christians, Yazidis, Shia Muslims, were given impossible choices: convert, flee, or die. Ancient shrines that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble with sledgehammers and explosives, filmed carefully for propaganda before the dust even settled. Mosul was no longer merely occupied, it was being erased and rewritten in the image of the caliphate. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi chose Mosul for a reason. When he climbed the pulpit of the great mosque of Al-Nuri and declared the birth of a new Islamic caliphate, he was not just announcing a state, he was staking a claim to history. Mosul became the capital of ISIS Iraqi holdings, its largest city, its most valuable prize. Bureaucrats arrived. Tax systems were imposed. Courts dispensed brutal justice. What could not be controlled was destroyed. The cost to civilians was immediate and devastating. Once home to nearly 2.5 million people, Mosul bled its population steadily. Families fled at night, bribing guards, slipping through back alleys, risking execution if caught. By 2016, barely 1.5 million remained. Those who stayed did so not by choice, but by entrapment. Roads were mined, exits sealed. Escape became a death sentence. Children grew up under the sound of sermons and gunfire. Teenagers were recruited or executed. Men learned to keep their eyes down and their mouths shut. Every knock at the door carried terror. ISIS did not merely rule Mosul. It suffocated it, draining the city of breath while turning it into a fortress. And yet, beneath the oppression, Mosul endured. Radios were hidden. Old friendships survived in whispers. Some waited patiently, believing the nightmare could not last forever. Others believed no one was coming. When liberation finally loomed in 2016, it did not feel like hope. It felt like dread. The people of Mosul understood what the world was only beginning to grasp, that removing ISIS would not be clean or quick. The city had been turned into a weapon. Every street was rigged, every building prepared for death. The battle to come would not simply be about defeating an enemy. It would be about reclaiming a city already half destroyed and deciding how much of it could survive the attempt. The fall of Mosul in 2014 did not come out of nowhere. It was the final rupture in a country that had been quietly fracturing for more than a decade. To understand why ISIS was able to seize one of Iraq's largest cities almost without a fight, one had to look back, not to Syria, not even to sectarian militias, but to the long shadow cast by the American-led invasion of 2003. When Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed, it did so completely. The Iraqi state was dismantled with stunning speed. The army was disbanded, ministries gutted, and tens of thousands of armed men were suddenly left without jobs, salaries, or futures. What was meant to be a clean break with dictatorship instead created a vacuum, one filled by resentment, fear, and opportunism. In the years that followed, Iraq struggled to rebuild itself, but the foundations were unstable. Power increasingly flowed through sectarian lines. The new government in Baghdad, dominated by Shia parties, was viewed with suspicion, often hostility, by large segments of the Sunni population, particularly in the north and west. For many Sunnis, the post-2003 order felt less like liberation and more like exclusion. The Iraqi security forces reflected these divisions. Though rebuilt with American funding and training, they were plagued by corruption, poor leadership, and political interference. Promotions were often bought, not earned. Units existed on paper, but not in reality, their salaries siphoned off by officers. Morale was brittle. Loyalty to the state was fragile. Mosul sat at the center of this dysfunction. A predominantly Sunni city governed by distant authorities in Baghdad, it had become alienated long before ISIS arrived. Checkpoints multiplied. Arbitrary arrests fueled anger. Local grievances went unanswered. When extremist groups began probing the city in the early 2010s, they found not universal support, but dangerous indifference. Meanwhile, insurgent networks that had survived the defeat of al-Qaeda in Iraq were quietly regrouping. Former Ba'athist officers, intelligence veterans, and radical clerics forged uneasy alliances. They shared little ideologically, but they were united by a common enemy, the Iraqi state as it existed after 2003. By the time ISIS emerged in its new, more ruthless form, Iraq was already exhausted. Years of bombings, sectarian killings, and political paralysis had eroded trust in institutions. Soldiers fought for paychecks, not belief. Civilians learned to survive by staying silent. So when ISIS columns approached Mosul in June 2014, they did not encounter a city ready to defend itself. They encountered a hollowed structure, an army unsure of its purpose, a population disconnected from its government, and leaders who underestimated the threat until it was too late. The collapse was not inevitable, but it was prepared. Mosul did not fall because ISIS was unstoppable. It fell because Iraq, long before the black flags appeared, had already been broken apart from the inside. If Iraq was fractured after 2003, Syria was shattered after 2011. What began as peaceful protests during the Arab Spring soon collapsed into one of the most brutal civil wars of the modern era. Cities burned, borders dissolved, and authority fragmented into a patchwork of militias, warlords, and foreign proxies. For extremist movements, Syria was not chaos. It was opportunity. As Bashar al-Assad's regime fought for survival, vast stretches of eastern Syria slipped beyond meaningful control. Arms depots were looted. Prisons were emptied. Fighters flowed in from across the region, drawn by ideology, revenge, or the simple promise of power. The border between Syria and Iraq, never tightly controlled, became little more than a line on a map. Out of this chaos, a familiar organization reemerged in a new and far more dangerous form. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, battered but not destroyed during the American surge years, reinvented itself. Its leaders had learned from past failures. This time, they would not merely plant bombs and fade into the shadows. They would seize land, rule openly, and build an army. By 2013, the group called itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. ISIS. It moved with calculated brutality, crushing rivals and absorbing fighters from across the jihadist spectrum. Former Iraqi military officers brought discipline and planning. Religious ideologues provided justification. Syrian battlefields became training grounds, refining tactics that would soon be unleashed elsewhere. The war in Syria gave ISIS something unprecedented: strategic depth. When pressure mounted on one side of the border, fighters simply slipped across to the other. Weapons, money, and recruits flowed freely. Oil fields captured in Syria financed operations in Iraq. Kidnapping, extortion, and taxation turned conquest into revenue. ISIS was no longer a guerrilla group, it was a state in waiting. Regional powers were slow to grasp the danger. Syria's war consumed international attention, while Iraq was increasingly treated as a secondary theater. Intelligence warnings went unheeded. Each actor assumed someone else would contain the problem. No one did. By the time ISIS turned its full attention back toward Iraq, it was no longer the insurgency Iraqi forces remembered. It was larger, richer, more confident, and armed with the experience of years of total war. Its leaders understood fear as a weapon and spectacle as strategy. When they advanced, they did so not just with guns, but with narratives carefully designed to shatter resistance before a shot was fired. Mosul, distant from Baghdad and poisoned by years of neglect, lay directly in their path. The fires of Syria had crossed the border, and in that heat, the most dangerous extremist force of the 21st century was about to be forged into something unstoppable, at least for a time. In early June 2014, the storm finally broke. ISIS fighters began probing Mosul's outer defenses, testing checkpoints, ambushing patrols, spreading rumors faster than bullets. To the outside world, it looked like just another insurgent flare-up. To those inside the city, it felt different, coordinated, deliberate, inevitable. The Iraqi forces stationed in Mosul were numerous on paper. In reality, they were hollow. Many units were undertrained, poorly led, and deeply mistrustful of their commanders. Corruption had eaten away at discipline. Officers inflated troop numbers to siphon salaries. Soldiers wondered quietly whether anyone would come to their aid if the city was truly attacked. When ISIS struck in force on June 6th, the illusion of control collapsed almost immediately. Fighters moved swiftly through neighborhoods, seizing police stations, overrunning checkpoints, and broadcasting their advance with chilling confidence. Videos circulated of executions and captured weapons, designed not just to document victory, but to accelerate panic. Within days, the Iraqi chain of command disintegrated. Orders conflicted. Reinforcements never arrived. Then came the moment that sealed Mosul's fate. Senior commanders fled. Some escaped by helicopter. Others vanished into civilian crowds. When soldiers saw their leaders run, resistance evaporated. Uniforms were stripped off and discarded in the streets. Weapons were abandoned in piles. On June 10th, Mosul fell. Not after a siege, not after a climactic battle, but through collapse. ISIS fighters walked into bases and arsenals overflowing with American-supplied equipment, Humvees, artillery, small arms, ammunition enough to arm an army. Overnight, the group transformed from a militant force into a mechanized one. The human consequences were immediate. Government buildings were seized. Prison doors were thrown open. Suspected opponents were dragged from their homes and executed in public squares. Christians were marked. Shia families fled. ISIS issued ultimatums, carving the city into zones of obedience and death. Just days later, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi appeared in the great mosque of Al-Nuri, calm, measured, dressed in black. From the pulpit, he declared the restoration of the caliphate. It was a moment carefully staged for history, a declaration meant to echo across the Muslim world. Mosul was no longer just a captured city. It was the capital of a new and terrifying experiment. For Iraq, the shock was existential. A city of nearly 2 million had vanished into enemy hands in less than a week. For ISIS, it was proof of destiny. For the people trapped inside Mosul, it was the beginning of a nightmare with no visible end. ISIS did not govern Mosul in chaos. It governed with structure, with paperwork, with rules enforced at gunpoint. Within weeks of taking the city, the group transformed conquest into administration. Offices reopened under new names. Taxes were imposed. Courts began issuing sentences. The black flag did not merely fly over Mosul. It embedded itself into daily life. Public punishment became ritual. Executions were staged in open squares, announced in advance, filmed carefully. Bodies were left on display as warnings. Theft meant amputation. Dissent meant death. Fear was not a byproduct of ISIS rule. It was its foundation. The group understood that terror, applied consistently, was cheaper than constant fighting. Women disappeared from public space. Schools were rewritten to serve ideology. History was purged, replaced by doctrine. Music vanished. Cigarettes were banned. Mosul's ancient diversity, Arab, Kurdish, Christian, Yazidi, Turkoman, was crushed into a single enforced identity. Those who did not fit were expelled or exterminated. The destruction of culture was deliberate. Shrines, mosques, libraries, and museums were demolished not in rage, but with intention. ISIS filmed these acts to prove its purity, to show the world it recognized no past except its own interpretation. What could not be rewritten had to be erased. Economically, the city was drained. ISIS taxed salaries, businesses, and even aid deliveries. Oil was smuggled. Antiquities were sold. Children were recruited. Teenagers disappeared into training camps or execution grounds. Parents learned not to ask questions. Survival depended on silence. By 2016, Mosul's population had collapsed from 2.5 million to roughly 1.5 million. Those who remained were trapped. Roads out were mined. Escape attempts were punished publicly. Entire families were executed as examples. ISIS needed civilians, not as people, but as shields. And yet, beneath the oppression, Mosul endured in fragments, radios hidden under floorboards, prayers whispered behind closed doors, acts of quiet defiance that could never be spoken aloud. Some waited for liberation. Others feared it more than ISIS itself, knowing what an urban battle would mean. When word spread that Iraqi and coalition forces were preparing to retake the city, hope and terror arrived together. For ISIS, Mosul was sacred ground. For its leaders, it was the heart of the caliphate. They would not abandon it lightly. The city had been turned into a fortress, and everyone inside it, fighter and civilian alike, was now part of the battlefield. Liberating Mosul was never going to be a sudden counterstrike. It would be a slow, deliberate process, measured in years rather than weeks. After the shock of 2014, Iraq faced an uncomfortable truth. Reclaiming its territory would require rebuilding an army that had already collapsed once before. The Iraqi state began again almost from scratch. Units were reorganized, commanders replaced, and training intensified. American and coalition advisors returned, this time with narrower objectives and harsher lessons learned. Air power would be decisive. Intelligence would be shared. But on the ground, Iraq would have to fight its own war. New formations emerged alongside battered old ones. The Iraqi army's conventional divisions were reconstituted, while elite units, especially the counterterrorism service, later known as the Golden Division, became the sharp edge of the coming offensive. These troops were trained for urban combat, disciplined, and battle-hardened by years of fighting ISIS in smaller cities and towns. To the north and east, Kurdish Peshmerga forces prepared their own campaigns. They had resisted ISIS when others fled, and they now held critical terrain around Mosul. Their role was not to retake the city itself, but to encircle it, to tighten the noose. Alongside them stood a complex and uneasy coalition. Sunni tribal fighters sought redemption after years under ISIS rule. Shia militias, powerful and controversial, mobilized under the banner of the Popular Mobilization Forces. International actors hovered close. American, European, and regional advisors guiding operations, directing airstrikes, and shaping strategy from behind the scenes. This coalition was strong, but fragile. Sectarian mistrust lingered beneath the surface. Baghdad feared that uncontrolled militias entering Mosul could ignite reprisals in a city already traumatized by years of extremist rule. Political compromise became as important as military planning. Decisions about who would fight where were shaped as much by fear of the aftermath as by the battle itself. By 2016, ISIS had been pushed back across Iraq, Tikrit had fallen, Ramadi had been retaken. Fallujah, once a symbol of insurgent resistance, was again under government control. Each victory came at a cost, but each one brought the front lines closer to Mosul. For ISIS, the writing was on the wall. The caliphate was shrinking, supply routes were cut, leaders were killed by airstrikes, but Mosul remained, the city where their dream had been declared and the place they intended to defend at all costs. By the autumn of 2016, more than 100,000 Iraqi, Kurdish, and allied troops were positioned around the city. Aircraft filled the skies. Artillery batteries waited in silence. The long road back was ending, and ahead lay the most dangerous urban battlefield of the 21st century. Just before dawn, on October 16, 2016, the silence around Mosul broke. Artillery thundered from the south, flashes rippling across the horizon as coalition aircraft streaked overhead. After 2 years of preparation, hesitation, and political calculation, the order was finally given. The campaign to retake Mosul had begun. The attack unfolded along 3 main axes. To the east and northeast, Kurdish Peshmerga forces advanced first, pushing through villages and farmland that ISIS had fortified in anticipation of the assault. To the south, Iraqi army divisions and federal police units moved steadily north, supported by armor and artillery. From the west, Shia-led forces sealed the desert approaches, cutting off escape routes toward Syria. The initial results were dramatic. Within the first 24 hours, coalition commanders announced the liberation of more than 20 villages. ISIS positions collapsed under the weight of airstrikes and coordinated ground assaults. Fighters fled, or were killed in large numbers. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the nightmare of Mosul might end far more quickly than anyone had dared hope. But the optimism did not last. As coalition troops pushed deeper, the nature of the fight began to change. Suicide bombers emerged from hidden tunnels, detonating themselves against advancing columns. Snipers fired from upper stories, then disappeared before they could be targeted. Roads detonated beneath armored vehicles, sending wreckage skyward. Progress slowed from kilometers to meters. To the northeast, efforts to retake the town of Bashika stalled due to logistical shortfalls and stiff resistance. Supply lines strained under the pace of the advance. Ammunition and fuel lagged behind the front. In the south, Iraqi units pressed on more deliberately, aware that speed without control could prove fatal in terrain saturated with explosives. By October 19th, Iraqi forces had surrounded Karakosh, once Iraq's largest Christian town, advancing to within 6 kilometers of Mosul's outskirts. Signs of panic began to surface inside the city. Intelligence reports indicated ISIS leaders fleeing westward, abandoning positions that could no longer be held. Those who remained behind were often foreign fighters, men with no local ties, no escape routes, and nothing left to lose. On October 20th, the battle escalated sharply with the arrival of Iraq's elite counterterrorism service, the Golden Division. These veteran troops moved quickly and aggressively, reinforcing Kurdish units to the east. In the fierce fighting that followed, they reportedly killed hundreds of ISIS militants while capturing the strategic town of Bartella. ISIS responded with desperation. As coalition forces advanced, militants set the Al-Mishraq sulfur plant ablaze. Toxic clouds drifted across the battlefield, killing civilians and sending nearly 1,000 people to hospitals suffering from chemical inhalation. It was a reminder that ISIS would burn anything, land, people, history, rather than relinquish control. The opening phase of the offensive had shattered the illusion of a quick victory. Mosul was fighting back, and the deeper the coalition advanced, the more vicious the resistance became. What lay ahead was no longer a campaign of maneuver. It was the beginning of a siege, slow, suffocating, and unforgiving. As the coalition's early momentum slowed, ISIS revealed the true nature of its defense. This was not an army trying to hold ground in the conventional sense. It was an organization built around delay, terror, and attrition. Every hour the battle dragged on was a victory in itself. Suicide bombers became the spearhead of resistance. Armored vehicles packed with explosives surged out of side streets and alleyways, detonating against advancing columns with devastating force. Others were sent on foot, blending briefly with civilians before sprinting toward soldiers and exploding at close range. Each blast forced the coalition to halt, regroup, and advance more cautiously. Snipers haunted the ruins. From minarets, apartment blocks, and shattered factories, ISIS marksmen picked off soldiers one by one. They fired sparingly, knowing survival depended on patience. A single shot could freeze an entire unit in place, buying precious time for other fighters to reposition through the tunnel network beneath the city. Oil fires added another layer of chaos. Thick black smoke rolled across the battlefield as ISIS ignited trenches and storage tanks, blinding aircraft and choking ground forces. Visibility dropped to near zero. Airstrikes became harder to coordinate. For soldiers on the ground, the smoke turned daylight into dusk, and every movement into a gamble. ISIS also struck beyond Mosul's immediate front lines. In a desperate attempt to divert coalition forces, militants launched a surprise attack on the oil-rich city of Kirkuk. The assault failed, but it revealed the group's intent. Stretch the coalition thin, force commanders to worry about multiple crises at once, and keep the initiative slipping just out of reach. Despite these efforts, the coalition advance continued, slowly, methodically, relentlessly. By October 24th, Iraqi officials reported that nearly 800 ISIS fighters had been killed and more than 70 villages liberated since the offensive began. Yet numbers told only part of the story. Every step forward came at increasing cost. As troops approached Mosul's eastern neighborhoods, the battlefield grew denser, more claustrophobic. Streets narrowed. Buildings rose closer together. Civilians, tens of thousands of them, were now interwoven with the fight. ISIS exploited this ruthlessly, positioning fighters near homes, schools, and mosques, daring the coalition to strike. Inside Mosul, fear tightened its grip. Residents reported executions of those suspected of cooperating with advancing forces. Entire families were dragged into the streets as warnings. ISIS was no longer pretending to rule for the people. It ruled through them, using their lives as shields against defeat. The illusion of rapid liberation was gone. What lay ahead was a brutal urban war measured not in days, but in neighborhoods, and paid for in blood. On October 20th, 2016, the character of the battle changed. Until then, Mosul's outskirts had been contested ground, villages, highways, and open approaches where maneuver was still possible. With the arrival of Iraq's counterterrorism service, known as the Golden Division, the war moved closer to the city's heart. The Golden Division was unlike any other Iraqi force on the battlefield. Trained intensively by American advisors and hardened by years of fighting ISIS in places like Ramadi and Fallujah, its soldiers were professionals in a war otherwise dominated by mass formations and militia politics. They moved in small units, advanced deliberately, and fought with discipline shaped by experience rather than ideology. Deployed to the Eastern Axis, the Golden Division reinforced Kurdish Peshmerga units that had advanced rapidly but now faced stiffening resistance. Together, they pushed toward Bartella, a Christian town that ISIS had occupied and depopulated. The fighting was sharp and violent. ISIS fighters resisted fiercely, knowing the town's fall would bring coalition forces to the very edge of Mosul's urban sprawl. Within hours, Bartella was retaken. Iraqi special forces swept through streets and buildings, clearing rooms one by one. Intelligence reports estimated that roughly 200 ISIS fighters were killed in the fighting. For the coalition, the victory was symbolic as much as tactical. The caliphate's outer defenses were crumbling, and elite Iraqi troops were now positioned to lead the assault into the city itself. ISIS responded with fury. As coalition forces consolidated their gains, militants set fire to the Al-Mishraq sulfur plant south of Mosul. Thick yellow smoke poured into the sky, drifting over villages and military positions alike. 2 civilians were killed, and nearly 1,000 people were hospitalized with respiratory injuries. It was not a battlefield tactic so much as a statement. ISIS would poison the land itself rather than surrender it. In a further attempt to disrupt the offensive, ISIS launched a diversionary attack hundreds of kilometers away, striking the city of Kirkuk. Fighters infiltrated neighborhoods, attacked security checkpoints, and attempted to sow panic behind coalition lines. The attack failed, repelled after heavy fighting, but it underscored the group's continued ability to strike unpredictably even as it lost territory. Despite these efforts, the advance toward Mosul did not stop. By October 24th, coalition forces had liberated nearly 80 villages around the city. ISIS casualties mounted, and reports emerged of fighters attempting to flee westward under cover of night. Yet those who remained were the most dangerous of all: foreign fighters, ideologues, and commanders with no future beyond Mosul. As the Golden Division paused just kilometers from the city's outskirts, its soldiers understood what awaited them. The battle ahead would not be about speed or territory. It would be about endurance, precision, and the willingness to fight street by street against an enemy that had prepared for this moment for years. As coalition forces closed in on Mosul, the nature of the battle grew darker. ISIS understood that it could no longer win through maneuver or firepower alone. Instead, it turned fully to its most effective shield: the people of the city themselves. Tens of thousands of civilians were forced into impossible choices. Families were driven from villages and herded back toward Mosul at gunpoint. Men were ordered to remain inside their homes. Women and children were positioned in buildings overlooking coalition advance routes. Those who resisted were executed publicly, their bodies left in the streets as warnings. Fear became both tool and message. For ISIS, civilians were not collateral damage. They were deliberate instruments of war. Fighters fired from rooftops knowing return fire would risk killing innocents. Snipers hid in apartment blocks filled with families. Suicide bombers blended into fleeing crowds. Every civilian presence slowed the coalition's advance, forced hesitation, and magnified the psychological burden on soldiers tasked with liberation. Inside the coalition command, this reality created a dilemma without easy answers. Speed favored ISIS. Caution cost lives. both military and civilian. Iraqi leaders, under intense international scrutiny, declared the protection of civilians a top priority. Airstrikes were approved carefully. Artillery fire was restrained, progress slowed further. The sectarian fault lines of Iraq added another layer of tension. Mosul was overwhelmingly Sunni. Baghdad's government was dominated by Shia parties. There were fears, real and justified, that unchecked militia forces entering the city could spark reprisals, turning liberation into another catastrophe. To prevent this, it was decided that only the Iraqi army and elite counterterrorism service units would enter Mosul proper. Popular mobilization forces were ordered to remain outside the city, sealing escape routes instead of fighting street to street. For ISIS, this restraint was an advantage. The slower the coalition moved, the more time ISIS had to prepare ambushes, reposition fighters, and terrorize civilians into obedience. The city became a maze of human shields and hidden death. Civilians caught in the middle lived minute to minute. Some attempted escape under cover of darkness, slipping through gaps in the fighting. Many were shot. Others stepped on mines. Parents taught children to remain silent during bombardments, to hide when footsteps approached, to distinguish between coalition aircraft and ISIS drones by sound alone. The battle for Mosul was no longer just military, it was moral. Every decision, every strike approved or denied, carried consequences measured not only in meters gained, but in lives lost. And as the coalition prepared to enter the city itself, one truth became unavoidable. Defeating ISIS would require fighting in the same streets where its victims still lived. At dawn on November 1st, 2016, the battle entered its most dangerous phase. Coalition forces crossed from the outskirts into Mosul itself. For the first time since 2014, Iraqi soldiers fought street by street inside the city that had once collapsed without resistance. This time, there would be no retreat. Airstrikes, artillery, tanks, and machine guns opened fire on known ISIS positions in the eastern districts. Buildings shuddered as explosions echoed through narrow streets. ISIS fighters responded immediately, igniting tires and oil pits to blanket the city in thick black smoke. Visibility dropped, turning urban combat into a close-range struggle measured in doorways and stairwells. The first advances were hard-fought. Iraqi units pushed into neighborhoods like Gojali and Karama, clearing houses one by one. Each building concealed traps, pressure plates beneath carpets, explosives wired to refrigerators, snipers waiting behind holes smashed through interior walls. Progress slowed to meters per hour. Soldiers learned to trust instinct as much as orders. Despite fierce resistance, the coalition made steady gains. By November 2nd, ISIS control in parts of eastern Mosul was reduced to scattered pockets. Supply routes leading toward Raqqa were severed, isolating fighters from reinforcements. Yet the cost was rising, casualties mounted. Civilians trapped between advancing troops and retreating militants were killed or wounded as the fighting crept closer to their homes. Weather soon intervened. Heavy rain grounded aircraft and limited air support, forcing Iraqi troops to pause or withdraw from exposed positions. In the Karama district, sustained ISIS resistance compelled a temporary pullback. The pause underscored a grim truth. Momentum in urban warfare was fragile, easily lost, and costly to regain. Still, the offensive pressed forward. On November 3rd, Iraq's 9th Armored Division entered the Al-Intisar neighborhood. By the next day, 6 additional districts had been liberated. Soldiers raised Iraqi flags over ruined apartment blocks, marking gains measured not in kilometers but in blocks of shattered concrete. To the south, Iraqi forces captured Hammam al-Alil, moving within 4 kilometers of Mosul International Airport. Each success tightened the ring around the city, compressing ISIS fighters into ever smaller spaces. Yet few commanders believed this pace could be sustained. Civilian protection remained paramount. Every building had to be cleared manually. Every suspected target double-checked. The rules of engagement slowed the advance, but they also prevented Mosul from becoming a city erased entirely by firepower. Eastern Mosul was falling, but it was not collapsing. It was being carved away piece by piece, at enormous cost. The battle had entered a phase where endurance mattered more than speed, and where the enemy's defeat would come not through a single breakthrough, but through relentless pressure and exhaustion. As fighting raged through eastern Mosul, coalition planners turned their focus to the river that defined the city's geography and its fate. The Tigris was more than a natural boundary. It was ISIS's last reliable artery. As long as bridges remained intact, fighters, weapons, and supplies could flow between eastern and western Mosul, allowing the caliphate to shift forces and prolong the battle indefinitely. There were 5 major bridges spanning the river. Each one became a strategic target. Coalition aircraft began a systematic campaign to destroy them, not all at once, but deliberately, one by one, tightening pressure while limiting civilian movement only when absolutely necessary. It was a grim calculation, but one deemed unavoidable. As bridges fell, ISIS' situation worsened rapidly. Fighters trapped in eastern Mosul found themselves increasingly isolated. Ammunition ran low. Commanders struggled to coordinate. Medical supplies vanished. Attempts to move reinforcements across the river were met with devastating airstrikes. At night, survivors tried to cross in small boats, risking death from above or drowning in the dark currents of the Tigris. By early December, only the old bridge remained functional. ISIS concentrated its defenses around it, launching counterattacks near the Al-Salam neighborhood in a desperate effort to slow the coalition advance. The fighting was fierce. At the Al-Salam hospital complex, ISIS resistance proved unexpectedly strong. Coalition forces were repelled after a bitter engagement that left roughly 20 Iraqi armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. It was a rare tactical setback, one that revealed how dangerous the final stages of eastern Mosul would be. Despite this, the broader picture was unmistakable. Nearly a quarter of the city had been liberated. ISIS's hold on eastern Mosul was unraveling. The coalition, however, was beginning to feel the strain. Equipment was worn, ammunition stocks thinned. Soldiers were exhausted from weeks of continuous combat in some of the harshest urban conditions imaginable. On December 21st, Iraqi commanders ordered a planned operational pause. It was not a retreat, but a reset. Vehicles were repaired, units rotated, fresh supplies were brought forward. The decision reflected hard-earned experience. Pushing forward without pause risked collapse just as surely as hesitation. 6 days later, coalition warplanes struck the old bridge. When it fell, eastern and western Mosul were finally severed. ISIS fighters on the eastern bank were cut off completely, their fate sealed. On December 29th, the second phase of the eastern offensive began. Coalition troops resumed their advance with renewed intensity, targeting the remaining ISIS-held districts. Resistance continued, but it lacked coordination. Fighters fought and died in isolation. Their communications fractured, their escape routes gone. By early January 2017, ISIS's defense of eastern Mosul was collapsing. The city had been cut in half, not just physically, but strategically. What remained was a matter of time, pressure, and the grim work of clearing the final pockets of resistance. Attention now turned westward, across the river, where an even deadlier battle awaited. By late December 2016, eastern Mosul was no longer a front. It was a wound slowly closing. ISIS resistance had fractured into isolated cells, fighting without coordination, without resupply, and without hope of reinforcement. Yet even as victory in the east became inevitable, coalition commanders understood a hard truth. Exhaustion could be as deadly as the enemy. Weeks of urban combat had taken their toll. Vehicles were scarred by shrapnel and IED blasts. Weapons needed repair. Soldiers, many of whom had been fighting continuously since October, were physically drained and mentally worn down. Clearing a city was not a sprint. It was attrition measured in stress, fatigue, and the cumulative weight of constant danger. On December 21st, Iraqi forces entered a planned operational refit. Units pulled back just enough to reorganize. Armored vehicles were repaired or replaced. Ammunition stocks were replenished. Fresh troops rotated forward while veterans were given precious hours of rest. The pause was brief, but necessary. Commanders knew that what awaited on the western bank of the Tigris would be even worse. During this reset, eastern Mosul was systematically secured. Remaining ISIS pockets were hunted down, buildings cleared, and civilians screened as they fled newly liberated neighborhoods. Iraqi forces moved cautiously, aware that fighters often disguise themselves as displaced residents. Tensions ran high. Every checkpoint was a test of discipline and restraint. At the same time, coalition planners turned their full attention to the next phase of the campaign. Western Mosul was older, denser, and poorer. Its streets were narrower. Its buildings stood closer together. Many neighborhoods dated back centuries, forming a maze that favored defenders armed with explosives and intimate local knowledge. If eastern Mosul had been difficult, the west promised something closer to nightmare. Intelligence estimates suggested that thousands of ISIS fighters remained across the river, many of them foreign militants with no intention of surrender. They had months to prepare. Tunnels had been expanded, traps multiplied. Entire blocks were believed to be wired for demolition. On December 27th, coalition aircraft struck the last remaining bridge across the Tigris. When it collapsed into the river, it marked the end of one battle and the beginning of another. Eastern Mosul was effectively liberated. Western Mosul was sealed and waiting. As 2017 approached, Iraqi soldiers stood on the riverbank and looked west. Across the water lay the birthplace of the caliphate's dream, a city within a city prepared to resist to the last. The pause was over. The hardest fighting of the war was still ahead. On February 19, 2017, after weeks of preparation and repositioning, coalition forces crossed the threshold into western Mosul. If the eastern half of the city had been a test of endurance, the west was something else entirely, a descent into the most punishing form of urban warfare modern armies could face. Western Mosul was older and denser, its neighborhoods woven together by narrow streets and centuries-old buildings. There was little room for tanks to maneuver, little visibility for aircraft overhead. ISIS had deliberately concentrated its remaining fighters here, turning the city into a maze of death. Every alley was a choke point, every doorway a potential trap. The assault began with a heavy bombardment. Coalition airstrikes and artillery targeted known ISIS strongholds, attempting to break the defenders before ground troops advanced. Yet destruction alone could not clear the city. Iraqi units moved forward slowly, methodically, clearing buildings one at a time. Progress was measured in meters, sometimes in rooms. The first major objective fell on February 24th, when Iraqi forces seized Mosul International Airport. Once a symbol of connection to the outside world, it had been transformed by ISIS into a fortified military complex. Its capture was strategically vital, giving the coalition a foothold deep in western Mosul and cutting off another potential ISIS supply route. But the victory came at a cost. The fighting was intense, with ISIS fighters launching suicide attacks and ambushes from concealed positions. As Iraqi troops pushed northward from the airport, resistance stiffened. ISIS employed chemical mortar rounds, releasing choking agents that injured soldiers and forced temporary withdrawals. Though the attacks were limited in scale, their psychological impact was immense. They were reminders that the group still possessed both the means and the willingness to violate every convention of war. Weather again complicated the offensive. Rain and low clouds grounded aircraft, reducing close air support and placing greater strain on infantry units advancing through hostile streets. Without eyes in the sky, every movement became more dangerous. ISIS exploited these moments, launching counterattacks designed not to retake ground, but to slow the advance and inflict casualties. Yet the coalition continued to grind forward. By early March, Iraqi rapid response units reported the capture of key government buildings, including the Nineveh Governorate complex. ISIS courts, financial offices, and administrative centers fell one by one, dismantling the bureaucratic heart of the caliphate's Iraqi capital. Despite these gains, western Mosul remained a killing ground. Civilians were still trapped in large numbers. ISIS fighters melted into the population, emerging only to strike. Each step forward demanded patience, restraint, and resolve. The battle had entered its most dangerous phase. The closer coalition forces moved toward the old city, the tighter the streets became, and the more desperate the enemy grew. Beyond the modern districts of western Mosul lay the old city, a place where time itself seemed to conspire against the attackers. Its streets were impossibly narrow, its buildings packed tightly together, many standing for centuries. What had once been a living record of Mosul's long history was now a perfect defensive maze. For ISIS, this was sacred ground. For the coalition, it was a nightmare. As Iraqi forces pushed closer in March 2017, the battle changed once again. Armored vehicles could go no further. Airstrikes, already constrained by civilian presence, became even riskier. The fight devolved into something older, almost medieval. Small groups of men advancing on foot, clearing houses with grenades and rifles, inching forward under constant threat from snipers and suicide bombers. Civilians were everywhere. Tens of thousands remained trapped in the old city, many held deliberately by ISIS as human shields. Families huddled in basements while fighting raged above them. Buildings collapsed under shelling, burying entire households beneath rubble. Rescue was often impossible. The sound of digging, hands clawing through concrete, became a grim soundtrack to the battle. Bad weather returned at the worst possible moment. Air support was repeatedly grounded by rain and low clouds, forcing Iraqi units to advance without the protection they had come to rely on. ISIS exploited every pause. Fighters emerged from tunnels to strike from behind, then vanished again into the earth. Every advance risked encirclement. Deliverance for many civilians came only with extraordinary effort. On April 18th, coalition engineers constructed a pontoon bridge across the Tigris. Under constant threat, it became a lifeline. Over the next 2 weeks, nearly 500,000 civilians fled the old city, streaming across the river with what little they could carry. For many, it was the first time they had seen safety in years. ISIS, meanwhile, abandoned any pretense of restraint. Fighters fired chemical rockets containing mustard agents, injuring Iraqi troops and foreign advisors alike. Women and children were increasingly used as suicide bombers, hidden among fleeing civilians. Trust became dangerous. Every approach carried the risk of betrayal and death. By late April, the old city was in ruins. Streets vanished beneath debris. Historic buildings collapsed. What remained was a shattered landscape where every step forward cost lives. Yet ISIS's grip was weakening. Its fighters were isolated, surrounded, and running out of space. The caliphate's final stronghold was shrinking by the day, and at its heart stood a single powerful symbol, one that both sides knew would mark the battle's end. As the battle closed in on the heart of the old city, Mosul was no longer recognizable as a city at all. It had become a compressed ruin, collapsed walls, shattered streets, and the constant echo of gunfire reverberating through what remained of its ancient core. ISIS fighters were now trapped in ever-tightening pockets, surrounded on all sides, their tunnels collapsing, their numbers dwindling. At this stage, the caliphate was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to leave a mark. The remaining militants operated in small, desperate cells. They struck suddenly, then vanished. Suicide bombers emerged from the rubble with no warning. Snipers fired from positions that would only ever be used once. Many fighters no longer wore uniforms, blending among civilians, blurring the final lines between combatant and victim. For Iraqi forces, the advance became agonizingly slow. Every building had to be cleared by hand. Every step forward risked hidden explosives or ambush. Entire streets were rendered impassable by rubble, forcing soldiers to breach walls and move through homes that still sheltered families hiding in fear. Then, on June 21, 2017, a thunderous explosion shook the old city. Smoke rose where the great mosque of Al-Nuri had stood for more than 8 centuries. Its famous leaning minaret, Al-Hadba, the symbol of Mosul itself, was gone. The mosque was not destroyed by coalition airstrikes. The blast bore the unmistakable signature of demolition from within. ISIS had deliberately blown it up. This was the place where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi had declared the caliphate in 2014. Its destruction was not an accident of war, but a final act of defiance. If ISIS could not hold Mosul, it would erase the symbol of its greatest claim to legitimacy. The caliphate would end in smoke rather than surrender. For the people of Mosul, the loss cut deeper than military significance. The mosque had survived empires, invasions, and centuries of change. In its destruction, many saw the final confirmation that ISIS had never been about faith or history, only control. For Iraqi forces, the explosion was both a warning and a sign of victory. The enemy was cornered. Desperation had replaced strategy. What remained were scattered fighters with nothing left to defend but rubble. In the days that followed, resistance continued, but it lacked coherence. The symbolic heart of the caliphate was gone. The story ISIS had told itself, and the world, had collapsed along with the mosque's walls. The end was no longer a question of if, only how long. On July 10, 2017, after nearly 9 months of continuous fighting, the Iraqi government declared victory in Mosul. Flags were raised, statements were issued. Images of exhausted soldiers standing amid ruins were broadcast around the world. Officially, the city had been liberated. Unofficially, the battle would continue for weeks more as isolated ISIS fighters were hunted down in basements, tunnels, and collapsed buildings. When the guns finally fell silent, the scale of destruction became impossible to ignore. Mosul was shattered. Entire neighborhoods in the old city had been flattened. Streets were buried beneath concrete and twisted metal. The Tigris flowed past ruins that once held centuries of history. What remained of the city looked less like a place reclaimed than one barely surviving. The human cost was staggering. On the coalition side, roughly 6,000 Iraqi and Kurdish soldiers were killed or wounded. ISIS lost an estimated 10,000 fighters in the battle, but the heaviest price was paid by civilians. More than 12,000 non-combatants were killed, many buried beneath rubble, others caught between ISIS defenses and coalition fire. Hundreds of thousands were displaced, emerging from the city carrying little more than memories and trauma. Mosul's liberation marked the effective end of ISIS as a territorial state. The caliphate that once spanned vast areas of Iraq and Syria was reduced to scattered cells and underground networks. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who had declared its birth from Mosul's pulpit, would be killed in a U.S. Special Forces raid 2 years later. The dream of a physical caliphate died with him. Yet victory brought no closure. The scars left behind were deeper than broken buildings. Families searched for missing relatives. Children returned to schools that no longer existed. Mass graves were uncovered. The question of justice, who had collaborated, who had resisted, who had simply survived, hung heavy in the air. Rebuilding Mosul would take years. Trust would take longer. Sectarian wounds, deepened by both ISIS rule and the brutality of urban war, could not be erased by military success alone. For many residents, liberation was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of a long, uncertain recovery. The Battle of Mosul entered history as the deadliest and most destructive urban battle since the Second World War. It was a clash not just of armies, but of ideologies, one that demonstrated both the danger of state collapse and the terrible cost of reclaiming a city once it has been turned into a weapon. And somewhere beneath the rubble, the echoes of that first declaration in 2014 still lingered, a reminder that while ISIS lost its capital, the conditions that allowed it to rise had not been fully buried. Mosul was free, but freedom, like the city itself, would have to be rebuilt from ruins.